That's right, we're here to talk about the Polar Grid X2 Pro again. Welcome back, I'm Dave from Chase the Summit, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive on the Polar Grid X2 Pro because if you've been following my channel for the past month or so, you might remember I already posted a video about this watch, but in that video I wasn't allowed to look at things like GPS or heart rate data or even some of the new features of this watch because the software at that time was not fully baked, it was not done, it was not ready for production. However, now it is. This watch is fully baked, it's got full production software on it, and I've been testing it out for well over a month now. So in this video today, I want to go through some of the nitty-gritty stuff I skipped out in that initial video, talk about things like GPS and heart rate accuracy, and I want to give you my overall experience and thoughts on this watch from a high level, what it's been like to live with, and what I think about it so far, because there's more to it than just accuracy. Before I dive into all of the nitty-gritty topics in this video, I do want to remind you, if you haven't yet, to go check out my initial video about the Grid X2 Pro, because that video is a good explainer on what this watch is, how much it costs, what the options are, and all that stuff. I'm going to skip all that in this video to just get to the point, but if you haven't seen that yet, go check it out. And with that, let's move right into the first topic, and that's going to be my impressions of the hardware and build quality so far after a month of using this watch. It's very good. As I've already stated in the initial video about this watch, for some reason, this watch really speaks to me at a hardware level. I really like the look and design and feel. I love the design accents that they executed here. And generally, I just really like the design of this watch, right down to the really unique texture that's sort of like a machined chatter mark around the bezel here. It just has a different look to it, and when it's on your wrist, it just feels like a premium piece of hardware. And while I've been wearing this watch, I've gotten comments on it left and right, especially when I've chosen to wear the leather band that is included with it. And from a hardware level, it doesn't just look good, it's also really well built. I've already whacked this thing off of like bricks and doorways, and I've fallen a couple of times while hiking and trail running, and it still looks brand new. There's absolutely no scratches on it. The sapphire is flawless. Anything you're seeing on camera is just dust or smudges or anything like that. It's just a really well-built watch, and the buttons on this watch are also really nice and haptic and have a really solid click to them. Just overall, a well-built watch, and it's a good-looking watch as well, in my opinion at least. Let's move on to software stability, because in the past with Polar watches, there have been some issues with glitches and hangups and restarts and things like that, and I'm happy to report that with this version of the software that I've been using so far, which is 2.0.19, I believe, at the time of filming this video, I have not had any instabilities, any crashes, anything happen during activity, after activities. They've seemed to have solved the issue that I was seeing in previous generations of this firmware. And on top of that, the user experience in the UI of this watch is also very snappy and responsive. There's no delay when you're swiping around screens or anything like that, and that is an issue that is present on some of the competition. On this watch, however, you get a great display and a really snappy user interface, and that does make it feel and look just a lot more modern. And when it comes to the actual user interface on the Grid X2 Pro, like I said in my initial video about this watch, it's basically exactly the same as the Vantage V3, the Vantage V2, the Polar Grid X. Like, they haven't really revamped their user interface at all, which is probably a good thing in one sense for people that are used to this user interface. You kind of just know where everything is right off the bat, which is nice. However, in my opinion, it does feel a little bit dated at this point, and I do wish they would add just a general UI update to it, maybe add some more, customization and colors and things like that. And the final topic I'll mention about the user interface is the new watch faces. As you can see here, I've been using this particular watch face ever since I got this watch, and I really like it compared to previous generations of Polar watches. This one just, again, looks a little bit more modern. It's got this kind of like clunky digital Casio look, which I say clunky in an endearing kind of way. I think it looks really nice. It sets off a sort of utilitarian vibe, and it's got a lot of data on it. We've got the time and date, and then we've got my weather and my steps for the day, and of course, these widgets at the bottom, or complications at the bottom of the screen here, are fully customizable. Now let's move into some of the heavier topics here, mapping and navigation, because at the time of filming my initial video with this watch, I didn't have the updated version with Breadcrumb mapping and navigation, and now I do. I've gotten to test it, and yes, the Breadcrumb mapping, as expected, expected, is very useful. If you don't know what breadcrumb mapping and navigation is, it's essentially a little trail that gets dropped behind you as you're moving along on the map on the watch. And the nice thing about having breadcrumb mapping is that you know where you were. So if you want to turn around, you need to find a different way back to the beginning of your activity, you can have some context of the surrounding areas. It works automatically. There's really no settings to it. You can't change the color of the breadcrumb trail or anything like that, but it does work well, and I'm happy it's there. And on top of the breadcrumb mapping and navigation, I also noticed some subtle improvements to the general mapping experience overall. It feels like the map tiles on the watch are loading a little bit quicker, things render a little bit smoother and faster, and panning and zooming around the map is just a little bit more seamless and easier to see and do. With that said, keep in mind these maps are not routable, so you can't like pick a point somewhere out in the distance and have the watch generate a route to get you there. It's essentially just a base map, sort of an image of a map that you can use for context of your surroundings. With mapping and navigation out of the way, let's dive into the next topic, and that is battery life. Because now that I've been using this watch for over a month now, I've got some real life experience with the battery life in both smartwatch mode when you're just living your everyday life and in GPS mode when you're recording activities. Now there are specs that go along with this. For example, in smartwatch mode, Polar says you can get about 10 days of use with the Grid X2 Pro before you'll have to charge again. And when you're in a GPS activity with the highest accuracy setting, you can expect about 43 hours of use, which are specs. But what is it like in real life? Well, I'm happy to report that the specs are pretty accurate in most cases. For me personally, I've been using the always on display ever since I got this watch because I like the way it works on the Polar Grid X2 Pro. With that said, the always on display on these watches take a big toll in terms of battery life. So in my experience so far, using the Grid X2 Pro, I've been getting between 3 and 5 days of use with the always on display turned on. And that's with regular GPS activities just about every day. So that's with the always on display turned on. But what if I turn it off and just use the gesture mode where the screen completely turns off until I raise my wrist? Well, that's a bit of a different story. Like I said, Polar claims you could get about 10 days with the gesture mode enabled without always on display turned on. In my situation, testing this watch, I've noticed I've been getting between like 6 to 8 days of use. So if you were to just use this as a smartwatch and not use it for going on runs or rides or anything like that, I think you could eke out that 10 days of battery life in smartwatch mode, but I think for most users, you could expect between 6 and 8 days with gesture mode and 3 to 5-ish days with the always on display enabled. But that's smartwatch mode. What about GPS battery life when you're out on a run or a ride and you're tracking that activity with the GNSS built into this watch? In that situation, like I said, Polar claims about 43 hours of runtime with GPS enabled activities. And in my testing so far, that seems just about dead on accurate. I've been doing lots of testing and I've been seeing a general loss of about 2.5% of battery life per hour of use. And that pretty much adds up to 43 hours of total battery during a GPS activity. So that's good to see there. However, one situation when it comes to battery life I did not see on Polar's spec sheet was always on display plus GPS activity and what kind of battery life you could get while using the always on display out on your run or ride. So I did lots of testing in this situation as well, and unfortunately this is a huge variable. It's going to depend what you're doing on the watch during that activity. For example, if you have the map page pulled up the entire activity and you're using the always on display and constantly looking at your map, that's going to cook your battery life. You're going to end up with like probably 15, 16 hours of battery life. That's just a guess, but it definitely reduces the battery life significantly when you're in the map page. On the flip side, if you've got the always on display turned on and you're just looking at general activity data, like your heart rate, for example, or your running power or your distance or speed or something like that, that's when you won't see as significant of a difference. But I would say you could expect around 20 hours of use with the always on display enabled in a GPS activity. Moving right along into the next topic, and probably one you're watching this video to find out about, GPS accuracy, because at the time of filming my first video on this watch, I didn't share any details about that. The interesting thing about the Polar Grid X2 Pro is that the GPS chipset inside this watch is actually the exact same chipset that's found in the Polar Vantage V3. They're using the same internal guts. The only difference on the Grid X2 Pro is that it got a slightly improved antenna design, because the way the body's built with all the metal bits, they had to redesign the antenna to improve and optimize accuracy. So how did that play out in real life? Generally speaking, the GPS accuracy coming from the Polar Grid X2 Pro is fine. I would say it's acceptable. However, I wouldn't say it's top of the line or like the leader in any way. For the most part, I'm getting pretty decent tracks, and if I wasn't comparing them side by side with other watches I have, I would say it's fine. There's nothing alarming about them. They're not notably way off or drifting way off in the distance. However, there is some GPS drift here and there, and one thing that does bug me about the Polar Grid X2 Pro is that initial fix when you actually start your activity. It does take an extra 30 seconds to get a good GPS fix, and you have to wait for it to turn green before you can start running, where my other watches tend to just get that fix right away. I'm definitely splitting hairs here, but I wouldn't say it's significantly better than something like the Polar Vantage V3. It's just kind of the same. With GPS accuracy out of the way, let's dive into the big one. This might be the biggest one about this watch: optical heart rate accuracy from the sensor on the back of the watch. Because if you remember, when the Polar Vantage V3 came out last year, a lot of us reviewers on YouTube did not give that watch a glowing review when it came to heart rate sensor accuracy. And unfortunately, the Polar Grid X2 Pro here also uses the exact same optical heart rate sensor that was found on the Polar Vantage V3. However, Polar claims that they've updated the algorithm and added some new lines of code and smarts to make this much more reliable and more accurate. And the nice thing about that update is that it's software based, so the reliability and accuracy that I'm seeing from the Polar Grid X2 Pro here will be the same on the Polar Vantage V3 because they're both receiving the same software update. So how does this software update translate into raw accuracy? I will say that the accuracy on the Grid X2 Pro is much better. I've noticed that the reliability and the accuracy have significantly improved over the previous generations of the firmware and from my experience with the Polar Vantage V3. I would say it's improved, it's much better. It's still not perfect, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And if you are a Polar Grid X2 Pro owner or a Polar Vantage V3 user, I encourage you to do your own testing with the heart rate sensor and let me know in the comments down below if you've seen an improvement with the new software release, because I'd love to hear from you. Okay, that brings us into the last segment of this video where I want to talk about the value of this watch in the comparison in the landscape of all the other watches out there right now and my experience so far. So this watch is very expensive, and I've talked about this before, but starting at around $750 and going all the way up to $870 here in the USA, that's right at the tippity top of premium devices from Garmin, from Coros, Suunto. You name it, you could get just about any watch out there, so why would you choose the Polar Grid X2 Pro over all of the competition? Well, that's a really tough question to answer. At the end of the day, who is this watch for and should you get it? Well, there's probably two people I would suggest to take a look at the Polar Grid X2 Pro. The first person is going to be someone who loves the Polar ecosystem. Maybe you have a Polar Vantage V2 or V3 and you want something in a more premium build and you love how the app and the website and it all works together, then definitely check out the Polar Grid X2 Pro because this is easily the best watch, the nicest looking and feeling watch that Polar has ever made. And the second person I would recommend to check out the Polar Grid X2 Pro is someone who doesn't want a complicated watch. For example, if you buy an Apple Watch Ultra 2 or a Garmin watch, there's so many menu items and fluff and things to sift through, and there's just tons of data, which on one hand, some people do like that quite a bit. On the other hand, a lot of people just want a simple watch that can track their runs and rides and give them general wellness data. And that's really where the Polar Grid X2 Pro shines. It gives you what you need in terms of fitness and wellness and not all of that other stuff that might just kind of get in the way and make things more complicated. And that's really where I think the Polar Grid X2 Pro fits in, and it's sort of competing against the likes of like the Coros Vertix 2S in that sort of minimalistic, simple device way, where the Vertix 2S has great battery life, but it's lacking the AMOLED display. The Polar Grid X2 Pro has that AMOLED display, but then there's the Suunto Race. There's too many devices out there, but you get what I'm getting at here. It's a simple device, it works well, it doesn't lag, and it is expensive, but if you want a premium Polar watch, this is the one to get. I hope that helps. And with that, we've made it to the end of the video, and now I want to hear from you. Drop into the comments down below and let me know if you've purchased a Polar Grid X2 Pro, what you think about it so far, or if you're just sticking with the Vantage V3 or some other watch out there. Drop into the comments, let me know. I would love to hear from you. And of course, while you're down there commenting, check out the description down below where I do have links to the Polar Grid X2 Pro and all of the other watches I talked about in this video. Those links do help support this channel, but they cost nothing extra to you. And while you're checking out those links, also check out the links over to my other social media accounts like my podcast, my Threads account, my Instagram, or my website where you can buy a sweet shirt like this. I'd really appreciate that. Okay, friends, if you found this video fun or helpful, entertaining, anything, please consider giving me a thumbs up and subscribing down below so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. And with that, I'm done here. I'll see you next time. Bye.